This lecture focuses on the physiology of the adrenal gland. Adrenal gland is an endocrine gland solely set aside as an endocrine gland. The entire structure is engaged in the production of hormones. Before we look at the hormones made by the adrenal gland and how important they are, let's talk about its anatomy just a little bit. The structure of the adrenal gland is shown here. It sits on top of the kidney. In fact, it shares the capsule that surrounds the kidney. That is shown here in the yellow lining. Then this is the portion of the kidney where it appears. Now, the inner structure of the adrenal gland is organized into two parts, the outer cortex and deeper medulla. The cortex is organized into several zones, which we'll talk about, and medulla is shown here. So this is the section of the adrenal gland showing a small amount of the capsule or a small portion of the medulla, but mainly the adrenal cortex. Now, the adrenal cortex makes one set of hormones. Those are steroids. Because they are made from the cortex, they are also called as corticosteroids. Medulla makes a wholly different type of hormones. These are catecholamines, epinephrine, and norepinephrine. All of these hormones that are made by the adrenal gland are related to the management or coping with stress. Okay, how to handle stress is where they help the body deal with stress. All right, so let's talk about the zones. The three zones here, zona glomerulosa, this is the one closest to the capsule, makes mineralocorticoids. Mineralocorticoids refers to these steroid hormones dealing with the regulation of minerals such as sodium ion, potassium ion, chloride ion. And the major mineralocorticoid is aldosterone. The second zone, that is a much deeper zone, is zona fasciculata. This is a wider zone compared to zona fasciculata. Zona glomerulosa. Zona fasciculata is the widest of the three. And here, the hormones, the corticoids made are referred to as glucocorticoids. Glucocorticoids deal with the regulation of blood glucose levels. Again, one major hormone, if you could think of, is cortisol or hydrocortisone. There are small amounts of other glucocorticoids such as corticosterone or cortisol. And the deepest zone in the cortex is zona reticularis. Okay, it's a narrow band compared to fasciculata, and this is where a small amount of androgens are made. Dehydroepiandrosterone is one that's mentioned in here. As I mentioned before, adrenal medulla makes epinephrine and norepinephrine. We will talk about those hormones in detail very shortly. So again, now we are talking about mainly the adrenal cortex, and the zones that we looked at are listed here: glomerulosa, fasciculata, reticularis, and aldosterone from glomerulosa mainly. Cortisol, although is assigned to fasciculata, the two layers, glomerulosa and fasciculata, both could be engaged in the secretion of cortisol, but mainly from fasciculata. You know, this can be a little confusing, but there is some overlap in the secretion of cortisol. Zona reticularis that secretes androgen, again, could be from these two layers, mainly from the reticularis. The two androgens that are shown here are dehydroepiandrosterone and androstenedione. These are some forms of androgens that would be converted into the more known forms of androgens. Those are testosterone and estrogens in specific tissues. Now let's talk about one hormone at a time. First one is from the zona glomerulosa, aldosterone. Aldosterone is essential for life. As you know, it is important for us to regulate the concentration of sodium ion and potassium ion. They are the ones that are involved in resting membrane potential, action potential, and many other functions that depend on these. And what triggers the secretion of aldosterone is where you have to think about one system, that is renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, which we will talk about in the next slide in detail. And one specific hormone within the system, angiotensin-2, is the key stimulator of aldosterone. Other stimulants, not as much as angiotensin-2, that trigger the secretion of aldosterone, are high levels of potassium ion in the blood, or low levels of sodium ion in the blood, or ACTH. This is a pituitary, anti-pituitary hormone that is mainly associated with the secretion of cortisol, but slightly in the secretion of aldosterone. Okay, here is a renin-angiotensin-aldosterone mechanism that is simplified. So let's talk about how this system is responsible for the secretion of aldosterone. First of all, whenever there is a low blood pressure, and that is going to be sensed in the renal arterioles, the blood vessels supplying the kidney, having low blood pressure would automatically trigger the secretion of renin. These are special cells in the nephron that sense low blood pressure and start releasing renin. Renin then targets a protein, angiotensinogen, that is made in the liver and converted into its intermediate form, angiotensin-1. Okay, renin converts angiotensinogen to angiotensin-1. As it circulates in the blood, there is an enzyme called angiotensin converting enzyme, or ACE, that acts on angiotensin-1 to convert it into angiotensin-2. Once you have angiotensin-2, there are a number of functions that angiotensin-2 is associated with. One of them is obviously the production of aldosterone. So that's the purpose of studying this mechanism here. But we could also look at the other key function of angiotensin-2. It's a potent vasoconstrictor. So it constricts blood vessels and increase blood pressure. That is a nice negative feedback effect, because we started off with low blood pressure, and at the end we increase blood pressure by releasing angiotensin-2, and also the release of aldosterone. So now we need to look at what aldosterone does to overcome this situation, that is low blood pressure, which is all summarized in this slide. So yes, whenever there is aldosterone in circulation, it increases the activity of the sodium-potassium pump. You already know what sodium-potassium pump does. It claims 3 sodium ions in exchange for 2 potassium ions, and that's exactly what you see. The reabsorption of sodium ions and the release of potassium ions in the kidney tubule. Okay, so you would release potassium ions into the tubular fluid, while we are reabsorbing sodium ions that is in the tubular fluid back into blood. All right, so ultimately the potassium ion that was released by the tubular cells will be removed in the form of urine. So we lose potassium ions, we gain sodium ions. By claiming sodium ions, what we're doing is to create this osmotic difference between the tubular fluid and the blood, and therefore water tends to follow sodium ion. So this is going to promote reabsorption of water by osmosis. So reabsorption of sodium ion, reabsorption of water, which would increase blood volume, which would increase blood pressure. So that is how we would be able to fix the original situation that turns on renin-angiotensin-aldosterone pathway. That is by claiming sodium ion, claiming water, and then increasing blood volume and blood pressure. And we also get rid of potassium ions in this situation. So this is all about aldosterone. You know that it's an important hormone in terms of the reabsorption of a key mineral, sodium ion, and reabsorption of water, and correcting the blood pressure. Okay. Now we'll focus on glucocorticoid, the chief hormone here, cortisol. Cortisol is a chronic stress hormone. You could also call it as a catabolic hormone. It targets the nutrients, all key nutrients, the carbohydrates, proteins, and lipids. One main function of cortisol is to promote gluconeogenesis, which is the production of glucose mainly from the amino acids. Okay, amino acids in the circulation and in the liver is converted into glucose and released into blood. Glycogenolysis, that is the breakdown of glycogen in the liver and releasing glucose. So its role is at many tissues. One major tissue is liver, as you can tell, where it has metabolic activity of breaking down protein and releasing amino acids, and then these amino acids are used in the production of glucose that's released into blood, and then targeting the glycogen sources and converting glycogen into glucose and releasing it into blood. And in the blood, you want to spare glucose, so it inhibits the glucose uptake by most cells, but not the brain, you see. And then it targets the breakdown of protein, which we already talked about in relation to gluconeogenesis. Yes, muscle protein is the main one that is targeted. Amino acids are released, and that is then converted into glucose in the liver. It also taps on the lipid sources in the adipose tissue, breakdown of these triglycerides, and then release free fatty acids, lipolysis. So all of these nutrients are broken down, therefore it's a catabolic hormone. And please note that it also acts on the muscle glycogen. However, when it breaks glycogenolysis, it doesn't really become glucose and it doesn't really get into blood, but then this glucose is available for the muscle contraction purpose, or the lactate that is produced is released into blood, and that is directly used in the synthesis of new glucose. So that is one effect at the muscle. All right, so then we are talking about yet another function of cortisol, that is its anti-inflammatory effect, immunosuppressive effect. It is accomplished in many ways. It would inhibit the activity of lymphocytes, inhibit the activity of mast cells, inhibit the activity of phagocytes. And by doing so, it keeps a check on inflammation. This is the reason why cortisol is widely used as a therapy in treating many inflammatory conditions. Okay, joint disease, asthma, and many type of conditions. Even the itching and rashes, skin conditions, where you would use cortisol to reduce those signs and symptoms. Okay, relief of pain by suppressing the inflammation. Okay. And the permissive effect, that is, it would be associated with another set of hormones such as catecholamines in causing vasoconstriction. Vasoconstriction is the main function of catecholamines, but it promotes catecholamines to accomplish this. Sometimes in a type of shock, you would notice that there is the vasodilation, and that is because of the lack of cortisol and lack of its permissive effect, and therefore less vasoconstriction. All right, with this idea, we will look at the regulation of the secretion of cortisol. What controls the production or the amount of cortisol that we see in circulation. There are two important hormones, one from the hypothalamus, one from the pituitary. Okay, the hypothalamic hormone, corticotropin releasing hormone or corticotropin releasing factor made by the hypothalamus, that is in response to a stressful situation. So there is a stressful condition that triggers the hypothalamus to make corticotropin releasing hormone, which then reaches the anterior pituitary and triggers the production of adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH, which then targets the adrenal cortex and specifically trigger the release of cortisol. Okay, cortisol, as you know, is involved in catabolic activities, basically elevating the blood glucose levels. Okay, so you ensure that there is a sufficient amount of glucose to deal with a stressful situation. Okay, so it spares glucose by targeting other nutrients, mobilization of fat, mobilization of protein, production of glucose from non-carbohydrate sources, and also anti-inflammatory effects. Okay, with this, we're done with the two key hormones, aldosterone and cortisol. Let's focus on zona reticularis and the small amount of androgens. The two androgens we talked about earlier, dihydroepiandrosterone and androstenedione. Now, these are androgens which would be converted into testosterone and estrogens elsewhere. The amount of these androgens is negligible in the male. Why? Because testes make a much greater amount of testosterone compared to the adrenal cortex. So the effect of these androgens in the male is not important. Whereas in the female, this is like the only source of androgens. And that is what is important in the changes that we see around the time of puberty, like the axillary and the pubic hair, the sex drive. So those are all from the androgens that are made by the adrenal cortex, specifically zona reticularis. Now let's focus on adrenal medulla. This is where we talk about two catecholamines, epinephrine and norepinephrine. It has a typo here. So I'll fix this, norepinephrine. Okay, so this is almost like the activation of the sympathetic system. Okay, chromaffin cells are nothing but neurons. They release these hormones in response to sympathetic activation. Okay, sympathetic activation releases epinephrine and norepinephrine. But then once you have these hormones, they get into blood and reach the entire body via blood and have receptors, whether it's an autonomic structure or not. Skeletal muscle fibers are non-autonomic structures, but they could have a vasodilation by the release of epinephrine by the sympathetic activation. So that's the kind of confusion you would have. Sympathetic activation would release epinephrine and norepinephrine, but epinephrine and norepinephrine action is not limited to autonomic structures, but any structure in the body with adrenergic receptors, alpha 1, alpha 2, beta 1, beta 2. All right, so that's how you would see increased heart rate, increased contraction force, constriction of blood vessels. Constriction of blood vessels is mainly by activating the alpha-1 receptors. I could also break down the preference they have for specific receptors. Norepinephrine specifically acts on alpha receptors, and epinephrine specifically targets beta 2 receptors. That's where it would cause bronchodilation. Airways, as you know, have beta 2 receptors. Epinephrine is the one that causes bronchodilation. And these hormones also have these catabolic activities, that is breakdown of glycogen and gluconeogenesis, that is the production of glucose at the liver by using non-carbohydrate sources. So they are catabolic hormones, okay, breakdown of lipids and production of glucose by acting at the liver and targeting non-carbohydrate sources, gluconeogenesis, producing glucose. But again, the goal is to have sufficient amount of glucose in the blood to deal with a stressful situation. Good. At this point, we'll stop, and the next lecture will be on the pancreas. Thank you.